Welcome back to Mograph Plus. It's Kamel Khezri here with you. In this section, we discuss lights and lighting in Redshift for Cinema 4D. In order to create a light, you can go to the Redshift menu, and here you have access to all the Redshift provided lights. I also have Redshift's render view duct in the UI. You can have it duct or floating, however you find it more comfortable. When we try to create a Redshift light, there are different types of lights that we can go for: infinite, point, spot, area, dome, IES, portal, and so on. Each type has its use and function, but they have lots of common attributes. The light type that you probably use more often is area light. Let's add one to the scene for now. If we take a look at its attributes and come down to this shape section, you notice by default area light has a rectangular shape to it, but we have four other area lights shape-wise as well: disc, sphere, cylinder, and mesh. For the moment, we take a look at common attributes of a Redshift light using a rectangular area light, as it is more used, and leave the rest for later, probably the next video. Area lights in general emit light rays from every point on their surface, and rectangular area light is used a lot because it resembles that smooth lighting from softboxes in real world, so it's a pleasing light source to the eyes. So let's start IPR. One of the cool things you can do in the render view is to define a camera to be used as the active camera, and this way, no matter the active view in the viewport, render view will always use the camera that you have defined in the camera dropdown here. We have this camera in the scene that's called camera 01, so let's use this dropdown menu and set it as the active camera and make sure it's locked. Now we can get out of our camera and position our light as we like, but the IPR still uses the defined camera to render the scene. Now let's position the light so it looks at our subject, which is this chair. To help with the proper placement of the light, we can add a target tag and a null. But instead of doing it manually, Redshift gives you a shortcut. If you come up, you see this small drop-down triangle at the top right corner of the light properties. Click on it and add a target tag and a null, and put the null near the chair. And now we can move the light around and it will always look at the chair. The light is too big and bright and produces very diffuse shadows. So let's select the light and in the attribute manager, change the light width and height to 100 centimeters and decrease its intensity to around 50 for now. The first thing you want to be able to control in a light source is its intensity and brightness. And for that, you can use this intensity multiplier value and this exposure value. By default, we use a generic unit called image to control the intensity of our light sources in Redshift. And the multiplier value for the intensity is set to 50 right now. If I decrease it to 10, we get a much darker light source. And if I increase it to, let's say, 100, the light becomes much more brighter. Then we have this exposure value, which does exactly what intensity parameter does, but in a different measurement. Exposure value is based on stops. So when the exposure is increased from 0 to 1, you are doubling the amount of light being emitted from the light source. From 1 to 2, you're doubling the overall emitted light again. Or you can use negative stops to take half the light intensity each time. I personally tend to mix between intensity and exposure. If I want a subtle change, I use intensity, and if I wanted more drastic adjustment, I tend to use the exposure value. For now, let's set the intensity to around 75 and exposure to 0. The next important attribute of a light is its size and how it relates to the intensity of the light and the quality of the shadows it produces in terms of soft or sharp shadows. Now down here you can change the size of your light. I can simply alter the width and the height of my light. Let's reduce the light size to 25 by 25 centimeters. When you decrease the size of your light, three things happen. the reflection of the light source on reflective surfaces will become smaller. The light itself will emit less light, and therefore we get a darker scene. And finally, the shadows it produces will become much sharper. Now, if you start increasing the size of the light to 50 centimeters, 75 centimeters, and maybe 100 centimeters, each time the light becomes bigger, its reflection on reflective surfaces will become bigger, the light will emit more light, and therefore we get a brighter scene and its shadows will become softer. That's one of the first things you need to learn about lighting. The smaller the light source, the sharper the shadows get, and the bigger the light source, the more diffuse the shadows will get. For now, let's set the size to 75 centimeters. Let's talk about this normalized intensity parameter down here that relates to the size of your light. If normalized intensity is disabled, which is by default, and we start decreasing and increasing the size of the light, you can see making the light bigger equals to having a brighter scene and emitting more light, and at the same time the shadows getting diffuser. And if I decrease the size, we get less emitted light and sharper shadows. When normalized intensity is turned on, in this case, we need to use higher intensity and exposure values. Let's try something like 12, 13 for the exposure. Now, increasing the light size won't affect the intensity of the light. It just makes the shadows to look more diffuse. Let's select our scale tool and make our light smaller and bigger. And as you can see, we only change how sharp or diffuse the shadow is and also the way the light appears in the reflections. But the intensity is unchanged. For now, let's set the size to around 75 centimeters. Actually, I wish that was the default behavior of a light as it gives you more creative control. For now, let's disable normalized and zero out the exposure value to get back to where we were. Now, this is how the light works when the unit type is set to image. For the other unit types, normalize will be hidden and won't affect the behavior of the light. If you change the unit from default to either luminous power or radiant power, let's try watts, and increase the exposure to around 10 to compensate. Now the light will have a constant intensity regardless of its size, like when the normalized was enabled when unit was set to image. So if I change the size of the light to 20 centimeters, the light will preserve its intensity with sharper shadows. And if set to, let's say, 300 centimeters, the light will have the same overall intensity with diffuser shadows. The other two units, which are luminance and radiance, are like the default unit, and therefore if used, the size of the light and its intensity will relate to each other. For now, let's stick to the default image unit, enable normalized, set the size to 75 centimeters, and set the intensity to 100 and exposure to 12. Now we want to be able to control the color of our lights. To do that, we have three options or three modes: color, temperature, and finally color and temperature. Whilst the mode is set to color, you can use this color picker and choose any color to be the color of your light. Let's try a few colors here. For now, let's get back to white. If we change the mode to temperature, the color of the light can be determined by using a Kelvin value. By default, it is set to 6500 and you get this white neutral color. A lower value, like let's say 3500, will result in a much warmer light source. And a higher value like 10,000 will result in a much cooler light source. For now, let's set it to 6500 to get our neutral white color back. And if the mode is set to temperature and color, we can use a combination of the two previous modes. For example, if I pick a reddish color, then I can use the temperature value to adjust that color. Not very useful, but it's there in case. For now, let's change the mode to color and use a simple white color. You can actually control the color of your light with a texture by assigning a texture to your light. A very useful scenario would be for a studio kind of product photography setup when you have a very reflective subject and the light reflection can't be just a simple white plane and you want to see a real world softbox being reflected off your subject. You can assign a softbox texture to your light color and get more realistic lighting and reflections. So not only the reflections will be more realistic, but also the overall feel and color of the light source. Let me quickly unhide the sphere and set the light size to around 350 centimeters. Let's also make sure the sphere material is very shiny with no roughness. Select the light again, and using this texture option we can load our texture. You can find this texture called umbrella, which is an EXR file from a reflective umbrella that is used in photography studios. Let's open it. And it would be nice to change the color space to linear sRGB as we are in ACES, and this is a high dynamic range image. And now we see this beautiful reflection in our sphere, and if I get out of the camera to see the entire scene and the light source itself, you notice we get this beautiful lighting from that assigned texture. The light source is not visible by default when seen directly by the camera. To make it visible, simply check this visible option down here. For now, let's delete the texture and use a white color, and also let's change the size to around 120 centimeters. Next, we have this bidirectional option, which makes the light to emit on both front and back sides. If you've been to a photography studio, you know they use different things like grids to control where exactly the light shines, to narrow the light only on the subject, to control light spilling, and thankfully Redshift Area Light has an option to exactly do that. Now we have this spread parameter that can do that. If I start decreasing the spread value towards 0, the light becomes more directional and narrower. We are making sure our light source only affects our main subject. And at 0, we have a fully directional light source. This is one of the most useful parameters that people tend to ignore. I wish there were more options like this to be able to direct lighting even more. For now, let's set it back to 1. While we are still here, let's take a quick look at this decay section. To assure a physically accurate decay or fall off for your light source, the decay type needs to remain at quadratic. If set to none, the light won't fall off and would have the exact same intensity in the entire scene. That's probably not something you want, but for artistic purposes, you can use this linear mode, which allows you to define a fall off start and stop for your light. Let's try something around 250 centimeters for the fall off start and maybe around 300 centimeters for the fall off stop. So the emitted light will start to affect the scene at around 250 centimeters away from its source and stops affecting the scene at around 300 centimeters. Let's get back to the default quadratic mode for now. And for now, let's get back to our camera. Let's take a look at the details tab and first come down to this contribution section. Diffuse contribution controls how much this light affects the diffuse portion of our shaders. If I zero it out, you can see the light is no longer affecting the diffuse portion of our shaders, but you can see it is still affecting the reflection of our shaders and is visible in the reflections. If I increase the diffuse contribution and zero out the reflection contribution, now the light no longer affects any reflection portion of our shaders and it's not visible in the direct specular reflections. Next, we have this transmission contribution. Let me unhide this glass object in the scene and hide the sphere and make sure the glass is between the camera and the light source. Transmission contribution controls whether the light source is visible through transmissive objects or not. For now, let's get back to the main camera and hide the glass. Single and multiple scattering contributions scale the intensity of the light when seen through subsurface single or multiple scattered materials. Some of the materials in the scene have subsurface scattering properties, and as I decrease the scattering contributions, you notice how they become black. We'll learn more about this when discussing subsurface scattering in the material section of the course. And this global illumination contribution here controls how much the light will be used in global illumination or indirect lighting calculations. To see this better, let's make the light a bit smaller, maybe around 25 centimeters, so we can have some sharper shadows. Now, if I set the GI contribution to 0, we get pitch black shadows, and if I click in the render view once and then hold down Control, the values you notice are 0. But if we set it to 1, the shadow will become a bit lighter and the values will show that as well. And to make that more obvious, we can use higher values than 1, which is not physically accurate. To make sure your render is physically correct, keep these values at 1. Now let's see what this volume contribution does. For this, let's get out of the camera quickly so we can see the entire scene. We can also set the size of the light to around 100 centimeters. Now let me temporarily add a Redshift environment object from the Redshift menu, which allow us to have atmospheric effects like volumetric scattering and fog. Now, even though we added a Redshift environment, but we cannot see any atmospheric effect in the scene, and that's because the light's volume scale contribution is set to 0. If we start increasing it bit by bit, we start to see the volumetric scattering effect. Maybe we can localize the effects more by making the light more directional if we just decrease the spread value. For now, let's set it back to 1. So using the volume contribution scale, you can define how much your light affects atmospheric effects. For now, let's set it to 0 and also delete the environment. Light groups will be discussed in the rendering section when learning about AOVs. Let's take a quick look at this shadow section. If we disable shadow, the light won't cast any shadows. You can also make the shadows lighter by increasing the transparency, which is not physically accurate. There are a few hidden parameters here, and they become available only if certain light types are used, like spot, point, infinite, and IES. For now, let's change the light type to point and set the intensity and exposure of the light to 20 and 12. Now, because this is a point light which is infinitesimal, we get very sharp shadows. To make the shadows softer, we can use the softness value. Let's try 10, 20, 50, 100. So the higher the value, the softer the shadows. We will talk about this caustic section when learning about caustics later on in the course. And finally, we have the usual Cinema 4D project tab to exclude or include specific objects in the illumination and shadow casting of the light. For example, if I want to exclude the chair, I can put it in the exclude list, and now the light won't affect the chair. I can specify whether this exclusion is only from illumination or shadow casting or both. Or I can change the mode to include, and now this light will only affect the chair and ignores the rest of the scene. Let's remove the chair from the list. For now, let's change the light type to area light, set the intensity back to 75 and 12. So that's about the common parameters of the Redshift light and specifically rectangular area light. The lesson is done and you can skip the rest of the video and move on to the next one, but in good conscience, I can't leave this scene like this without making a beautiful image out of it. I have this second camera in my scene for the final render. Let's look through it and make sure it's the active camera in the render view. I'm gonna stop the IPR for a moment and change the output resolution of the image to 1000 by 1500. Let's also use this second Redshift layout for this new vertical resolution and start the IPR again. I'm going to turn off the light that we created at the start of this lesson. I already created another simple rectangular area light and positioned it to the left of the chair. Its size is around 150 centimeters with the intensity set to 1 and exposure set to 4.5 and spread at around 0.5, which gives us this nice soft light. To make this more realistic, I'm gonna use an HDRI image as my environment light using a Redshift dome light. So add a Redshift dome light, which is a 360 degrees spherical light that encompasses the entire scene. In this light, I'm gonna load this HDRI image called bathroom and change the color space to linear sRGB, as we learned previously in the short ACES video in the previous section. And now we can start rotating the dome light around until we get something that we like. Probably something at around 217 degrees would be nice, and this gives us a nice fill light to our key light from the left. Now let's wait for the IPR to work on the render a bit more. And that's a better render compared to what we had before. In this lesson, we discussed area light in its rectangular shape, and in the next lesson, we briefly talk about a few other area light shapes that we have. See you there.